welcome back to the channel. Today we are opening a cold case that is 2,300 years old, and unlike most cold cases, this one does not involve an ordinary victim. This one involves the most powerful man who had ever lived. His name was Alexander, king of Macedon, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Persia, conqueror of the known world. In 12 years of continuous warfare, he never lost a single battle. His army marched from Greece to the edges of India. He defeated every empire, every general, every army that stood in his path. No enemy on earth could kill him. And then he went to a dinner party, and 12 days later he was dead. He was 32 years old. Today we are asking the question that historians, toxicologists, forensic scientists, and medical researchers have been arguing about for over 2,000 years. Was Alexander the Great poisoned, the most unconquerable man in history, brought down not by an army, but by someone sitting at his own table? And the most disturbing twist in this story: a leading medical researcher believes he may not have been dead at all when they buried him. Let's get into it. Act 1. The Man and the Empire. To understand why someone might want Alexander dead, you first have to understand what he had built, kind of man he had become by the end of it. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Macedonia, a kingdom in northern Greece considered provincial and rough by the polished city-states of Athens and Corinth. His father, Philip II, was a brilliant military innovator who had transformed Macedonia into the dominant power in Greece through a combination of battlefield genius and ruthless political manoeuvring. His mother Olympias was a fierce, religiously intense woman from Epirus who told her son from childhood that his real father was not Philip at all, but Zeus, the king of the gods. Alexander believed her, or at least he acted as though he did. He was tutored from age 13 by Aristotle, the greatest intellectual mind of the ancient world. He learned philosophy, science, medicine, literature, and the art of rhetoric. He carried a copy of Homer's Iliad, annotated by Aristotle, for the rest of his life. Sleeping with it under his pillow alongside a dagger, he modelled himself on Achilles, the great hero of the Trojan War, and saw his life as a continuation of that epic story. 20 years old, he inherited his father's throne. Following Philip's assassination, a murder that some ancient sources suggested Olympias herself had a hand in. Within 2 years, he had crushed revolts across Greece, destroyed the city of Thebes as a warning to anyone else considering rebellion, turned his eyes eastward toward the Persian Empire, the greatest power in the known world, ruling over territories stretching from Egypt to the borders of India. What followed over the next decade is almost impossible to believe even now. Alexander's army, never more than about 50,000 men, defeated the Persian Empire of Darius III, which fielded forces many times that number. He took Egypt without a battle. He founded the city of Alexandria. He was proclaimed pharaoh. He marched east through Persia, through modern-day Afghanistan, through the Hindu Kush mountain range in winter, and into India, further east than any Greek had ever gone. But the man who returned from those campaigns was not the same man who had left. 12 years of brutal warfare, extreme heat and cold, multiple serious wounds, including an arrow through his lung in India that nearly killed him, had taken a severe physical toll. The psychological cost was equally serious. Alexander had become increasingly erratic, suspicious, and volatile. He had killed his closest friend Cletus in a drunken rage at dinner, and then collapsed in grief for 3 days afterward. He had demanded that Greeks and Macedonians prostrate themselves before him in the Persian manner, the same ritual of divine obeisance that his own men found humiliating and degrading. He had adopted Persian dress and customs which his Macedonian generals deeply resented. He was drinking heavily He was executing officers on suspicion of disloyalty. He was talking seriously about campaigns to conquer Arabia, North Africa, and Western Europe. The man seemed to have no intention of ever stopping, and the people around him, the generals, the regents, power brokers, who had built their careers in his shadow, were running out of patience. Act 2. The Last Days. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander was in Babylon, the great ancient city of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, preparing for his next campaign. He was 32 years old. He was in his drinking prime, ancient sources put it, and he was drinking a great deal. On the evening of May 29th, 323 BC, Macedonian nobleman named Medius of Larissa invited Alexander to a banquet. The ancient sources describe it as a drinking party. The kind of evening Alexander had been attending with increasing frequency in the final months of his life. At some point during that evening, after drinking a large bowl of unmixed wine, Alexander was suddenly struck by a sharp, severe pain. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus recorded the moment precisely. Alexander drank the wine. The pain came without warning. He had to be helped from the table and taken to his bed. He never fully recovered. Over the following days his condition fluctuated. He developed a high fever. He suffered from intense thirst. He reported stabbing abdominal pain. He became progressively weaker. Periods, he seemed to rally. He was carried on a litter to supervise his troops, refusing to appear helpless before his army, and then collapsed again. His speech began to fail. He could no longer walk. Eventually he could barely lift his hand. On approximately June 10th, 11 days after the dinner at Medius's house, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon. He was unable to speak in his final hours. According to the ancient account, as his generals filed past his bedside asking who he was leaving his empire to, he whispered only, "To the strongest." He left no named heir, succession plan, no instructions for what was to become of the largest empire the world had ever seen. And then the strangest thing happened. His body did not decompose. For 6 full days, in the summer heat of Mesopotamia, in a city notorious for its sweltering humidity, Alexander's body showed no signs of decay, no discoloration, no smell, no putrefaction. His contemporaries took this as confirmation of his divine status. A god's body did not rot like a mortal's. Modern science has a very different explanation, and it is one of the most disturbing details in this entire story. Act 3. The Science. Let us start with what the ancient sources recorded about Alexander's symptoms, because the symptom list is the foundation of every theory about his death. He was struck by sudden severe abdominal pain after drinking wine, high fever, progressive weakness moving upward through the body, intense thirst, gradual loss of the ability to speak, loss of movement, finally. 6 days before his body was officially declared dead, what appeared to be complete cessation of vital signs. 4 main theories have emerged from 2,000 years of analysis. Let us go through each one honestly. Theory 1. Natural disease. The 2 most commonly cited natural causes are typhoid fever and malaria. Typhoid fever, caused by the bacterium Salmonella typhi, can produce exactly the kind of prolonged fever, abdominal pain, progressive weakness that the ancient sources describe. Babylon's water supply in 323 BC would have been highly susceptible to bacterial contamination. Alexander had been campaigning through regions where typhoid was endemic for over a decade. Malaria has also been proposed. However, as toxicologists and historians have noted, malaria does not typically follow the specific symptom progression described, and no outbreak of any kind was recorded among Alexander's broader army at the time. Theory 2. Alcohol poisoning Alexander was a heavy drinker by any ancient or modern standard. Some historians have proposed that cumulative damage from years of excessive alcohol consumption, combined with an acute episode at Medius's dinner party, simply overwhelmed a body already weakened by years of war and serious wounds. Problem with this theory is the symptom pattern. The classic profile of acute alcohol poisoning involves vomiting, disorientation, and loss of consciousness, not the sustained, lucid, progressive deterioration that the ancient accounts describe. Alexander reportedly remained mentally sharp, giving orders, recognizing people, speaking coherently, for most of his 11-day illness. That is not what alcohol poisoning looks like. Theory 3. The white hellebore. Poison in 2014, research team published findings in the peer-reviewed medical journal Clinical Toxicology, identifying the most plausible poison candidate. If Alexander was indeed murdered, the plant was Veratrum album, white hellebore. White hellebore was a medicinal plant used in ancient Greece and Macedon to treat a range of conditions, including, ironically, fever. It was well known to physicians of the era. In small doses, it was therapeutic. In larger doses, it was extremely dangerous. Critically, it produces a very specific and recognizable symptom profile. Sudden severe abdominal pain after ingestion, followed by burning in the mouth and throat, vomiting, a drop in heart rate, progressive weakness, slow deterioration toward death over the course of days to weeks. That symptom profile matches the ancient accounts of Alexander's death with settling precision. White hellebore was also, and this is the detail that matters for the murder theory, completely tasteless when dissolved in wine. A killer who knew what they were doing could add it to a drinking cup without detection. And in a culture where unmixed wine was consumed in large quantities at elite dinner parties, the initial symptoms could easily be attributed to the wine itself, rather than to what had been added to it. Researchers at the time concluded that the most plausible scenario, if poisoning occurred, was a deliberate or accidental introduction of Veratrum album into Alexander's wine at the dinner hosted by Medius of Larissa. Theory 4. He was not dead. This is the theory that changes everything else. In 2019, Dr. Catherine Hall, a senior lecturer at the Dunedin School of Medicine at the University of Otago in New Zealand and a practicing clinician, published a paper in the Ancient History Bulletin arguing that Alexander did not die from any of the above. She argued he died of Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare but serious autoimmune disorder in which the body's own immune system attacks the nervous system, causing progressive ascending paralysis. GBS can be triggered by a bacterial infection, specifically Campylobacter pylori, which was common in Babylon's water and food supply. In 323 BC, produces exactly the symptoms recorded in the ancient accounts. Progressive weakness moving upward through the body, loss of the ability to speak, loss of movement, while the patient remains mentally aware throughout, calm, lucid, trapped inside a body that is shutting down. The truly an extraordinary implication of Hall's theory is what it means for the 6 days of non-decomposition. She argues that Alexander was not actually dead when his doctors declared him dead. He was in a profound paralytic coma. GBS can produce a state of complete apparent death, with no visible breathing, no detectable pulse, and no response to stimulus. His body was not decomposing because he was still alive. He was buried alive. Hall calls it potentially the most famous case of pseudo-thanatos, false diagnosis of death, ever recorded in history. Think about that. Greatest conqueror in history, lying in the palace of Babylon, completely paralyzed and unable to move or speak, while his generals argued over his empire in the next room. Act 4. The suspects. Now let us talk about the people who had reason to want him dead. because regardless of what science says about the mechanism, the political reality of 323 BC is damning. Antipater and Cassander. Antipater was Alexander's regent in Macedonia, the man left in charge of Greece and Macedon, while Alexander campaigned in Asia for over a decade. He was elderly, powerful, and increasingly alarmed by Alexander's behaviour. In the months before Alexander's death, Alexander had removed Antipater from his post and summoned him to Babylon. Anyone who paid attention to Alexander's recent pattern of behaviour knew what being summoned to Babylon often meant. Several of his generals had been summoned and then executed. Antipater sent his son Cassander to Babylon instead, ostensibly to negotiate on his father's behalf. Cassander arrived in Babylon just weeks before the dinner at Medius's house, just weeks before Alexander's symptoms began. The ancient conspiracy theory, recorded by multiple historians including Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, and Arrian, named a specific chain of custody for the poison. Antipater obtained it. He gave it to Cassander. Cassander transported it to Babylon, concealed in a mule's hoof. The story being that the poison was so corrosive it could only be transported in material that would not dissolve. Cassander's younger brother Iolaus was Alexander's personal cupbearer. Medius of Larissa, who hosted the fatal dinner, was a close friend of Iolaus. The chain runs: Antipater, Cassander, Iolaus, Medius, the cup. What happened after Alexander's death makes Cassander's guilt appear more credible, not less. Cassander went on to seize the throne of Macedon. He executed Alexander's mother Olympias. He executed Alexander's wife Roxana. He executed Alexander's young son, Alexander IV, the last legitimate heir. He killed every member of Alexander's direct bloodline, every single one, and then he declared himself king. A man who murdered an entire royal family to take a throne is a man capable of poisoning the king. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's closest childhood friends. A general, a brilliant political mind, and one of the most trusted men in the inner circle. He ended up ruling Egypt after Alexander's death, and founded a dynasty that lasted 300 years, the dynasty that would eventually produce Cleopatra. Ptolemy is a suspect for reasons that are subtler than Cassander, but no less interesting. He is the one who stole Alexander's body as it was being transported back to Macedonia for burial, hijacking the funeral procession and bringing the remains to Egypt. He then built a magnificent tomb for Alexander in Alexandria and used the body as a political symbol for his own legitimacy. Ptolemy was involved in any plot against Alexander is unproven, but his extraordinary behaviour in the immediate aftermath, stealing the body, building the tomb, using Alexander's remains to legitimize his own rule, suggests a man who had thought very carefully about what Alexander's death would mean for him personally. Aristotle, this is the most uncomfortable suspect on the list. Alexander's own tutor, one of the greatest intellectual figures in human history, is named in the ancient sources as the one who provided the poison at Antipater's request. The two men were closely connected. Aristotle had been recommended to Philip II by Antipater. The motive attributed to Aristotle was Alexander's execution of Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, on suspicion of involvement in a conspiracy. Alexander had grown increasingly paranoid in his final years, and Callisthenes had publicly criticized the king's adoption of Persian customs. Executed. Aristotle is named as the poison source in ancient accounts. No modern evidence confirms or denies it. The idea that the man who shaped Alexander's mind and values may have helped end his life adds a layer of tragedy to the story that is almost Shakespearean. Act 5. The problem with proving it here is where the cold case hits its most frustrating wall. Alexander's body is lost. Tomb has never been found. Alexandria, the city he founded, where his remains were displayed for centuries, has been excavated for over 100 years, and the tomb has not been located. Without a body, there is no DNA. Without DNA, there is no toxicology. Without toxicology, there is no definitive answer. What we have are ancient texts written decades and centuries after his death by historians who were working from earlier sources that no longer exist. Those texts disagree with each other in significant ways. The accounts that describe poisoning most vividly, particularly the version naming the chain from Antipater to Cassander to Iolaus, were written in political environment where Cassander was already a hated figure. It was convenient to paint him as a murderer. It may also have been true. The symptom profile of white hellebore poisoning, and the symptom profile of typhoid fever, and the symptom profile of Guillain-Barré syndrome overlap considerably. Without a body to examine, distinguishing between them is essentially impossible. What we can say is this: the circumstantial political evidence for murder is extremely strong. Cassander arrived in Babylon weeks before Alexander's death. Brother was the cupbearer. Medius, who hosted the dinner, was their close friend. Cassander subsequently murdered every member of Alexander's family and took his throne. The motive, the opportunity, the subsequent behaviour all point in the same direction. What we cannot say is that the science confirms it. The science says he could have died of natural causes. It just cannot rule out that he didn't. Verdict 2,300 years after a man fell ill at a dinner party in Babylon. We are still arguing about what killed him. The scientific evidence tells us that white hellebore poisoning is the most forensically plausible murder mechanism. A tasteless plant poison that matches his symptom profile, that was available and known in the ancient world, that could be dissolved in wine without detection. The Guillain-Barré theory tells us something even more disturbing: that Alexander may have been pronounced dead while still alive, paralysed and aware, possibly experiencing his own premature burial in the sweltering heat of Mesopotamia. Typhoid theory tells us that a man who spent a spell of 12 years drinking from foreign rivers and eating from foreign fields in some of the most disease-ridden environments in the ancient world could simply have run out of luck. And the political evidence tells us that the people with the means, the motive, and the opportunity were sitting in that room with him. Cassander had the poison, the connection to the cupbearer, the dinner party host in his pocket. And he went on to murder every surviving member of Alexander's family to take the throne for himself. History has never charged him. The evidence has never been enough to convict. But I want to leave you with one final thought. Alexander spent 12 years conquering the known world. He survived arrow wounds, sword wounds, near drowning, the Hindu Kush in winter, the Gadrosian desert in summer. He was one of the most physically resilient human beings who ever lived. And he died, suddenly, unexpectedly, within days of a dinner party. At 32 years old, without ever naming a successor, leaving behind an empire with no plan for what happened next. Within 20 years of his death, every general who had been in that room in Babylon had declared themselves king of their own territory. The empire that took 12 years to build was divided among the men who had watched him die. Someone got exactly what they wanted, whether they helped it happen. That question has outlasted every empire Alexander ever built, and we still do not have the answer. If this opened something for you, leave it in the comments. And subscribe and stay with us, because we are just getting started on the ancient, world's greatest unsolved cases